Imagine a world where human beings are bought and sold like cattle. This is not a distant nightmare, but a stark reality that shaped the history of Europe and the Americas. In the 10th century, the Italian city-states of Venice, Genoa, and Florence became the epicenters of a brutal trade, the enslavement of Central Europeans, particularly the Slavs. The term slave itself comes from Slav, a people who lived in a vast region stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Balkans. Traders from Italy and other parts of Western Europe saw an opportunity in the Slavic lands. They captured and sold these people, often to Muslim traders who transported them to Mediterranean ports and beyond. The port of Marseille in France and the bustling city of Venice became major hubs for this human cargo. Slavs were not the only victims. Saxon peoples from northwest Europe also found themselves in chains sold to the Muslim world. This trade was not just about cruelty. It was a way for Western Europe to balance its economic deficits. With little valuable goods to trade, European countries turned to human lives to buy luxury items like silk, ivory, spices, and sugar from the Muslim world. The Muslim world, too, had its own system of slavery. After the conquest of non-Muslim territories, those who resisted were often sold into slavery. Sub-Saharan Africans were transported to work in sugar plantations in the Persian Gulf and gold mines in Egypt. The scale was massive. By the medieval era, Muslim slave traders had moved an estimated 7.45 million sub-Saharan Africans, a number that doesn't even account for those who died during the journey. As the Crusades began in 1095, Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa saw a new market. They supplied slaves to the Crusaders in the Holy Land, who used them to expand sugar production in places like Tyre, Sidon, and Acre. But the trade didn't stop there. Muslim authorities in the East Mediterranean also turned to these Italian middlemen for slaves. Genoa even had its own slave market by 1190, where Muslim black slaves were sold. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in 1346, killed up to a third of the population. The resulting labor shortage led to a dramatic increase in the demand for slaves. In 1363, Florence allowed the unrestricted importation of slaves from outside Italy to fill the gap. The cities-states of Italy became even more involved in the slave trade, both within Europe and abroad. Spain and Portugal, which had been involved in the intra-European slave trade since the 10th century, began to expand their reach. They took Muslim slaves during their conflicts with Islamic kingdoms in the Iberian Peninsula. They also started bringing African slaves to their Atlantic island colonies like the Cape Verde Islands, Madeira, and the Canaries. By 1480, Lisbon in Portugal had a slave market, and African slaves made up 2.5 to 3% of the population. In the Spanish city of Seville, a 1565 census showed that 7.4% of the population was African and enslaved. Portugal, in particular, was the trailblazer in this expansion. They captured the Moroccan city of Ceuta in 1415 and began moving south along Africa's Atlantic coast, seeking grain, gold, and slaves. They wanted to cut out the trans-Saharan Muslim traders who had previously brought these goods to the Mediterranean. The Cape Verde Islands became a key staging area for the trade, where African slaves were used in agriculture and then re-exported to other destinations. When Christopher Columbus discovered the New World, the European explorers found themselves with a new problem. They tried to force the labor of the native populations in the Caribbean and Central America, but the locals were unaccustomed to the intense labor required for sugarcane and mining. European diseases like smallpox decimated the native population, leading to a severe labor shortage. Spain and Portugal, already experienced in the slave trade, turned to Africa for a solution. By 1650, 350,000 African slaves had been shipped to Spanish America, and 250,000 to Brazil. The British and Dutch, though initially late to the game, soon joined the trade. English privateers like John Hawkins and John Lovell seized cargo ships carrying slaves and sugar in the 1560s. The British didn't start using African slaves in their colonies until the 1650s, when they gained access to the African coast and had the capital to import slaves. The Dutch, ruled by Spain and Portugal until 1640, began undermining Iberian trade by capturing African and Caribbean sites. They built extensive plantation cultures in places like Suriname and the Caribbean islands. In the British colonies, the idea of a plantation worked by slaves became a symbol of wealth and success. Cities like Bristol, Liverpool, and Glasgow became key ports in the transatlantic trade, where goods were exchanged for slaves. The Triangle Trade saw ships carrying trade goods to Africa, then slaves to the Americas, and finally goods like sugar, cotton, and tobacco back to Europe. By the 18th century, the practice of slavery was so deeply ingrained in British and European society that it was rarely questioned. The wealth generated by the slave trade and plantation agriculture was a cornerstone of the economy. But a change was coming. Some Europeans, particularly those who witnessed the brutal conditions of plantation slavery, began to question its morality. This was the beginning of a long and difficult journey towards abolition. The story of the transatlantic slave trade is one of human greed and cruelty, but it is also a story of resilience and resistance. As we delve deeper into this history, we will uncover the complex web of economic, political, and social forces that shaped this dark chapter of human history. John Wesley and his brother Charles, both recent graduates from Oxford, visited South Carolina in 1736 to 1737. They witnessed slavery firsthand and later wrote about their negative experiences in their journals. Charles, known for writing hymns, even penned lyrics against slavery in 1758. Their contemporary, George Whitefield, had a more complex view. While he obtained slaves to work at the orphanage he set up in Savannah, Georgia, he also wrote a strong letter criticizing the harsh treatment of slaves in the colonies. A turning point in the fight against slavery came in 1772 with the Somerset case in England. Lord Mansfield, a judge, ruled that English law did not support slavery, and therefore no one could be held as a slave in English territory. However, this ruling had limitations. Slaves could still be sold in England until 1792, and the ruling did not apply to British colonies where slavery continued. During this time, the Quakers, or the Society of Friends, began to speak out against slavery. One of their most influential members, Anthony Benezet, a French Huguenot refugee living near Philadelphia, wrote several books arguing against slavery. His writings influenced John Wesley, who became more determined to fight against it. In New England, Congregationalist Pastor Samuel Hopkins, influenced by theologians like Jonathan Edwards, changed his views on slavery in the 1770s. He began writing and speaking about the need to end slavery, and even published a book in 1776 called A Dialogue Concerning the Slavery of the Africans. In England, former slave trader John Newton, who later became a minister, wrote Thoughts Upon the African Slave Trade in 1787. Newton and John Wesley both encouraged William Wilberforce, a key figure in the British abolitionist movement, to fight against slavery. In 1787, the Presbyterian Church in the United States recommended that its members do everything they could to promote the abolition of slavery and educate African Americans. Despite these efforts, progress was slow. The French Revolution in the 1790s caused public disorder, and fears of slave uprisings, like the one in Santo Domingo, now Haiti, made it harder to advance the cause of abolition. However, by 1807, Britain passed a law making it illegal to trade slaves between West Africa and the Caribbean, and in 1808, the United States also banned the importation of new slaves. By 1818, the Presbyterian Church declared that slavery was a violation of human rights and inconsistent with Christian teachings. While Britain abolished slavery throughout its empire in 1837, the United States remained deeply divided over the issue. Some states, like Pennsylvania, had already abolished slavery by 1780, but others in the South strongly resisted any talk of abolition. This division led to intense disagreements among Christians, especially between the North and South. The Methodist and Baptist churches split into Northern and Southern factions, and the Presbyterians followed suit in 1861 just as the Civil War began. Many people today think that Presbyterians were not on the right side during this conflict, but this is not entirely true. While some Southern Presbyterians, like James Henley, Thornwell, and Robert Dabney, defended slavery, others, like Robert Breckinridge from Kentucky, opposed it. In the North, some Presbyterians, like the Reverend Gardner Spring, supported gradual emancipation rather than immediate abolition. The Presbyterian Church's lack of action in the face of slavery is a significant criticism, as they had previously called for its end but did little to enforce it. The Emancipation Proclamation in 1862 to 1863 and the 13th Amendment in 1865 freed all slaves in the United States. However, the newly freed African Americans faced significant social and economic challenges. The integration of African Americans into churches and society was slow, but there were some positive developments. For example, Princeton theologian Benjamin Breckinridge Warfield advocated for racial integration in churches and supported the admission of African American students to Princeton Seminary in 1915. South Africa, another region with a strong Calvinist influence, also grappled with racial issues. European immigrants, mostly from the Netherlands, arrived in South Africa in 1652 and brought with them a belief in the superiority of their culture and religion. They introduced slaves from Africa and Asia into the colony and developed a society that favored European settlers. By 1857, the Netherlands Reformed Church, which had earlier allowed intermarriage between Europeans and indigenous people, began to separate into different racial congregations. This separation reflected both the growing Christian influence among non-Europeans and the economic interests of the European settlers. When the British took control of the Cape Colony in 1806, they brought new settlers and missionaries who advocated for the rights of indigenous people. The British also passed laws to ban the slave trade and eventually abolish slavery. However, some Dutch settlers, unwilling to accept equality under British law, moved north to establish independent republics where they continued to uphold their racial attitudes. The history of Calvinism and its relationship to slavery and racial issues is complex. While many Calvinists, like those in South Africa, were associated with racist policies, many others, like those in the United States and Britain, fought against slavery and advocated for racial equality. The struggle against slavery and racism was a long and difficult one, but it ultimately led to significant progress in the fight for human rights. The journey of Calvinism through the years is a bit like the tide of the ocean. Sometimes it rises, and sometimes it falls. In the 1970s, when I first became part of the Reformed movement, I didn't realize how many ups and downs this tradition had gone through. Now I understand that these ups and downs are just as important as the times when Calvinism was growing rapidly. They teach us what to do and what not to do. One of the biggest challenges Calvinism faces is dealing with its own extreme followers. Sometimes, these followers treat John Calvin and the city of Geneva in the 1500s as perfect, and they think everything should be measured against that. This can be a problem because it ignores the diversity of ideas that have always been part of Calvinism. It's also hard for Calvinism to admit that some of its beliefs can be really tough to understand or accept. People who don't agree with Calvinism often point out these issues, and sometimes they have a point. To move forward, we need to understand the history of Calvinism and the different forms it has taken over the years. This will help us see that Calvinism isn't just one fixed idea, but a living, changing tradition. Let's take a quick look at some of the major waves of Calvinist resurgence over the past 2 centuries. In the last few years, especially since 2006, there has been a big revival of Calvinism, especially among younger people. In 2006, a magazine called Christianity Today featured a cover story about this revival. They even made a book about it, called Young, Restless, and Reformed. This book talked about leaders like John Piper, Mark Driscoll, and C.J. Mahaney, who were drawing large crowds of young adults to their churches in cities like Seattle, Memphis, Atlanta, and Minneapolis. The media picked up on this, and soon the New York Times Magazine and Time were writing about the new Calvinism. The idea was that this new wave of Calvinism had suddenly appeared, almost out of nowhere, without any real history before it, but that's not quite true. There were earlier movements that laid the groundwork for today's revival. One of the most important predecessors to today's Calvinism was the movement led by Martin Lloyd-Jones, a famous preacher who ministered at Westminster Chapel in London from 1939 to 1968. Lloyd-Jones was a key figure in spreading Reformed theology throughout the English-speaking world. He was influenced by the works of B.B. Warfield, a prominent Reformed theologian from the early 1900s. Lloyd-Jones was involved in many important initiatives, such as the International Federation of Evangelical Students, the London Bible College, and the Tyndale Fellowship for Biblical Research. He also co-founded the Banner of Truth, a movement known for publishing and reprinting older theological works. This helped revive Reformed theology in the UK and the US, where it had been declining. Lloyd-Jones's influence extended to North America, where he inspired people like James Boyce, who spoke about the expansion of Reformed theology in the 1970s. Boyce and others organized the Philadelphia Conferences on Reformed Theology, which brought together many leading Reformed thinkers. Understanding the history of Calvinism is crucial because it shows us that today's revival is not a completely new thing. It's part of a long tradition that has seen many ups and downs. Each wave of Calvinism has left behind ideas and books that continue to influence the next generation. No single wave has been perfect, and each one has built on the strengths of the previous waves. By recognizing this, we can avoid the mistake of thinking that our current understanding of Calvinism is the only true or best one. Instead, we can appreciate the diversity and richness of the Reformed tradition and learn from the mistakes and successes of the past. This will help us move forward in a way that is both faithful to the core teachings of Calvinism and responsive to the needs of the present day. The story of Calvinism from the 1850s to the 1950s is a tale of resilience and renewal. During these decades, the world saw significant changes from the optimism of the late Victorian era to the devastating impact of 2 world wars. Through it all, Calvinism found new life and spread its influence across continents. In the late 1800s, a young Dutch minister named Abraham Kuyper was a key figure in this revival. Kuyper had been trained in liberal theology, but eventually embraced a more traditional and pietistic form of Calvinism. He became a powerful voice, emphasizing the idea of antithesis to highlight the unique aspects of the Christian faith and common grace to encourage engagement with the world. By 1886, Kuyper led a significant movement out of the National Reformed Church, forming the Gereformeerde Kerken in 1892. This movement spread to immigrant communities in the United States, Canada, South Africa, and Australia, showing the lasting impact of Kuyper's ideas. In Britain, the Victorian era saw a resurgence of Calvinism, especially among the working class. Charles Haddon Spurgeon, a Baptist preacher, drew thousands to his Metropolitan Tabernacle in London. His ministry was part of a broader trend of urban Calvinist churches serving the working class. Similarly, in the United States, Mark Matthews, a Presbyterian minister in Seattle, built a large congregation and was known as America's Spurgeon. The early 1900s brought new challenges. The optimism of the pre-World War I era was shattered by the realities of war and the rise of liberal theology. However, this period also saw the emergence of key figures who kept the Calvinist flame alive. In 1914, the Sovereign Grace Union was founded in England, advocating for regular conferences among European Calvinists. By 1938, these conferences had become the International Calvinist Congresses, drawing scholars from around the world. In the United States, Princeton Seminary, a stronghold of Calvinist orthodoxy, faced internal conflicts. In 1929, J. Gresham Machen and others left to found Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, which became a major center for Reformed theology. Arthur W. Pink, a self-taught writer, published The Sovereignty of God in 1918, influencing many with his emphasis on God's majesty and power. Lorraine Boatner's The Reformed Doctrine of Predestination, 1932, became a key text for American Calvinists. Louis Berkhof's Systematic Theology, 1932, was another influential work used in seminaries across the English-speaking world. Berkhof's comprehensive approach to Reformed theology helped lay a foundation for future generations of Calvinists. The post-World War II period saw further expansion of Calvinism. In Britain, Martin Lloyd-Jones led a revival of Calvinist thought, while in the United States, James Boyce noted the growing influence of Reformed theology. The International Association for Reformed Faith and Action, formed in 1953, continued the work of uniting Calvinists across denominational lines. Throughout these decades, the ideas of Abraham Kuyper, particularly his emphasis on the comprehensive nature of Christ's lordship, continued to inspire new generations of thinkers and leaders. The translation of Dutch Reformed works into English, such as those by G.C. Berkwer and Herman Ridderbos, further enriched the global Calvinist community. The story of Calvinism, from the 1850s to the 1950s, is a testament to the enduring power of ideas and the resilience of the faith that has faced numerous challenges but continues to thrive. In the early 1800s, a wave of religious revival swept through Western Europe, particularly among Calvinists. This movement, known as the Revival, was not limited to just one country or city. It spread from Geneva and France to other parts of Western Europe, including the Netherlands and Britain. In the Netherlands, a Frisian pastor named Henry de Kock underwent a significant change in his beliefs. In 1829, he discovered John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion in a friend's library. De Kock, who had been trained in a more relaxed form of theology at the University of Groningen, was deeply moved by Calvin's writings. He soon embraced a more strict and traditional form of Calvinism, aligning himself with the teachings of Calvinist writers from the previous century. In 1834, de Kock was expelled from the National Reformed Church, and he led a succession of 120 congregations. This movement in the Netherlands was closely linked to the Reveil in Geneva, Paris, and Montauban, where scholars and students were also studying Reformed theology and organizing Bible study groups. They were determined to counteract the intellectual and social changes brought about by the French Revolution. In Britain, the late 1700s and early 1800s were a time of great revival and missionary activity. Names like John Newton, Rowland Hill, George Burder, and John Angel James were prominent figures in this era. The modern missionary movement began with William Carey's journey to India in 1793. Inspired by this, evangelical Calvinists in London formed the London Missionary Society in 1795, sending workers to China, South Africa, the South Pacific, and France. The Religious Tract Society, 1799, and the British and Foreign Bible Society, 1804, were also established, with evangelical Calvinists playing key roles in these organizations. In America, the Reformed tradition was also experiencing a revival. Timothy Dwight, the president of Yale College, brought new spiritual vitality to the institution. In 1806, a group of students at Williams College in Massachusetts held a prayer meeting under a haystack, which later became the starting point for American foreign missionary efforts. Asahel Nettleton, an evangelist and heir to Jonathan Edwards, continued to see significant success in his ministry during the early 1800s. In 1812, Princeton Seminary was established as a separate entity from Princeton College, and Archibald Alexander was called to be its first professor of theology. These movements show that the spiritual awakening of the 1700s, often called the Great Awakening or Evangelical Revival, did not simply fade away at the turn of the century. Instead, it continued to grow and evolve, influencing new generations of believers. The international chaos of the French Revolution and Napoleonic era did not hinder these efforts. Rather, it opened new opportunities for the spread of the gospel. Each of these revivals was a blend of old and new. They drew on the rich heritage of the Reformed tradition, while also addressing the challenges and opportunities of their own time. This blend is important because it keeps the movement dynamic and relevant. If a movement focuses only on repeating old ideas, it can become outdated and disconnected from the present. On the other hand, if it only emphasizes contemporary trends, it may lose its historical roots and theological depth. The Reformed tradition, with its focus on a biblical and God-centered approach to faith and life, offers a valuable perspective that can benefit both believers and non-believers. It is a tradition that has faced setbacks and challenges, but has also shown remarkable resilience. As we look at the history of Calvinism, it is clear that no single movement or individual can claim to be the sole source of its resurgence. Instead, it is a shared effort that spans different times and places. In the end, the key to a strong and lasting movement is unity and forbearance. We should recognize that the Reformed faith is broader than any single group or tradition. It is essential to focus on what we hold in common and to work together to promote the central doctrines of the faith, just as the early Reformers did. This approach can help us avoid the pitfalls of divisiveness and promote a more vibrant and effective Christian community. Arminius thought Calvin's commentaries were more valuable than the writings of the early Church Fathers. This shows how highly Calvin's work was regarded even centuries after his time. However, the popularity of Calvin's work, especially his Institutes, saw a decline after 1609. It wasn't until the early 1800s that interest in his writings began to rise again. This dip in popularity might be surprising, given how influential Calvin was. As the Reformed movement spread, it evolved in various ways. In England, for example, the Puritans started to look to other theologians for guidance, sometimes preferring the works of Jerome Zanchius over Calvin. This shift shows that even within the Reformed tradition, there was room for diverse influences. Some historians, like Gordon Rupp and Richard Greaves, have explored how Reformed theology in England was shaped by earlier influences, such as Lollard and Lutheran ideas. This mixing of influences made the Reformed theology in England unique. In the 19th century, there was a renewed interest in Reformed theology. One significant event was the publication of a detailed biography of John Knox, a key figure in the Scottish Reformation by Thomas Machree in 1811 and 1813. This helped to revive interest in the Reformed tradition in Scotland and beyond. The 19th century also saw the publication of new translations of Calvin's works, such as the Beveridge translation of the Institutes, which became a standard text. These translations kept Calvin's ideas alive and accessible to new generations. Calvin's influence wasn't just limited to his writings. His ideas about church organization and worship were also significant. For example, Calvin believed that the church should have a clear structure with roles like pastors, teachers, and elders. He also had strong views on the frequency of the Lord's Supper, suggesting that it should be celebrated more often than it was in some churches. However, Calvin's ideas on predestination, the belief that God has already decided who will be saved, have been a source of debate. Some, like Lorraine Bottner, have strongly defended Calvin's view of predestination, while others, like Paul Jewett, have critically examined it. Calvin's views on predestination were influenced by earlier thinkers, such as Martin Bucer, and evolved over time. Calvin saw predestination as a way to understand God's sovereignty and the assurance of salvation. Calvin's influence extended beyond his immediate followers. He corresponded with other reformers and leaders, and his ideas spread through various channels, including the writings of his contemporaries and the documents they produced. For example, the Consensus Tignorensis, a document from 1554, reflects the shared beliefs of Calvin and other Reformed leaders. Despite the debates and changes, Calvin's legacy continued to shape Reformed theology well into the 19th and 20th centuries. His ideas about the sovereignty of God, the authority of Scripture, and the nature of the Church remain central to Reformed thought today. In 1559, John Calvin, a prominent figure in the Protestant Reformation, published a new edition of his famous work, Institutes of the Christian Religion. This edition marked a significant shift in Calvin's thinking. Previously, Calvin had discussed God's eternal predestination, the idea that God has already decided who will be saved and who will not, alongside the concept of providence, God's control over all events. However, in the 1559 edition, Calvin separated these two ideas. This change suggested that Calvin believed God's decision to make distinctions among humans was made before he considered that humans would fall into sin through Adam's disobedience. This shift in Calvin's thinking was not unique to him. After Calvin, other Reformed theologians, like Richard A. Muller, noted that there was a range of opinions within the Reformed tradition. Some believed in a single predestination to life, while others believed in a dual predestination to both salvation and damnation which God decided before he allowed the fall to happen. Heinrich Bullinger, a contemporary of Calvin and a key figure in the Swiss Reformation, also wrote about predestination. Bullinger's approach was described as temperate and moderate by Cornelis P. Van Ema, a scholar who studied Bullinger's work. Bullinger's views were influenced by his collaboration with Calvin, especially in the Consensus Tignorensis, a document that outlined the shared beliefs of the Geneva and Zurich churches on topics like baptism. This document emphasized that only the elect, those chosen by God for salvation, would benefit from the sacraments. Another important figure in the Reformed tradition was Jerome Zonchius. His work, The Doctrine of Absolute Predestination, indicated that he held a post- or sublapsarian view, meaning he believed God's decision to elect some for salvation and others for damnation was made after the fall. This stance was different from the supralapsarian view, which holds that God made this decision before the fall. Peter Martyr Brumidli, an Italian reformer, also wrote about predestination. His work, The Common Places, emphasized the importance of God's sovereignty in salvation. Vermigle's views were influential in the development of Reformed theology, particularly in England and the Netherlands. Theodore Beza, a student and successor of Calvin, also wrote extensively on predestination. In his work, A Brief Declaration of the Chief Points of Christian Religion, Beza outlined his views on how predestination and reprobation, the idea that some are destined for damnation, relate to God's will. While Beza's views were pronounced, they were not the central focus of his theology. William Perkins, an English Puritan, further developed the concept of predestination in his work, The Golden Chain, or the Description of Theology. Perkins emphasized that God's predestination was based on his sovereign will, and that those who are elect are chosen for salvation. The doctrine of predestination was also a central topic in various Reformed confessions. The 39 Articles of the Church of England and the Belgic Confession both address the idea of election, emphasizing that God's choice of the elect is based on his grace and mercy, not on any merit of the individuals. However, the doctrine of predestination was not without controversy. The Canons of Dort, formulated in response to the teachings of Jacob Arminius and his followers, rejected the idea that God's election was based on foreseen faith or good works. Instead, they affirmed that God's election is based on his sovereign will alone. The Westminster Confession of Faith and the Second Helvetic Confession also addressed predestination, emphasizing that God's decision to save some and not others is based on his sovereign will, and that those who are not elect are left to the just consequences of their own sins. Despite the diversity of views within the Reformed tradition, the core belief in God's sovereign election and predestination remained a defining characteristic of Reformed theology. The acronym TULIP, which stands for Total Depravity, Unconditional Election, Limited Atonement, Irresistible Grace, and Perseverance of the Saints, is often used to summarize these beliefs. However, it is important to recognize that the use of TULIP has varied widely over time, and the Reformed tradition is more complex and nuanced than this acronym alone can capture. The history of the Reformed understanding of predestination shows that it has been a subject of much debate and discussion. From Calvin and Bullinger to Zanchius and Beza, the Reformed tradition has grappled with the profound mystery of God's sovereign will in the salvation of humanity. As we wrap up our journey through the rich history of Calvinism and its impact on the Christian faith, it's clear that the story is far from over. From the heated debates of the 17th century to the modern discussions of today, the ideas of John Calvin and his followers have continued to shape the way people understand God, salvation, and the world around them. Let's take a step back and look at how Calvinism has evolved over time. In the early days, the Synod of Dort was a pivotal moment. This gathering of theologians from across Europe in 1618 to 1619 was a response to the Arminian controversy, which questioned some of the core beliefs of Calvinism. The Canons of Dort, the result of this synod, laid out the 5 points of Calvinism: total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. These points, often remembered through the acronym TULIP, became the cornerstone of Reformed theology. But the story doesn't end there. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, Calvinism faced new challenges and found new supporters. Thomas, Scott, and Edward Williams, among others, defended Calvinist ideas against critics like Bishop Tom Line. John Allen even translated Calvin's Institutes into English, making these ideas more accessible to a broader audience. One of the most significant shifts in the understanding of Calvinism came in the way people talked about the atonement. The term limited atonement was not always the preferred language. Instead, many Calvinists used the phrase particular redemption, to emphasize that Christ's death was intended specifically for the elect. This shift in language reflects a deeper theological debate about the nature of Christ's sacrifice and the extent of God's grace. In the 20th century, the term TULIP gained widespread popularity, thanks in part to Loraine Boettner's book, The Reformed Doctrine of Predestination. This acronym became a quick and easy way to summarize the key points of Calvinism. But it also had its drawbacks. Some argued that it oversimplified complex ideas and could be used to force conformity in ways that didn't always reflect the depth and nuance of Reformed theology. Despite these challenges, Calvinism has remained a vibrant and influential tradition. It has shaped the liturgy and confessions of many churches, including the Reformed Church of America and the Christian Reformed Church. The Canons of Dort, along with the Heidelberg Catechism and the Belgic Confession, are still considered foundational documents for these denominations. But the influence of Calvinism extends beyond the walls of these churches. It has played a significant role in the broader evangelical movement, particularly in the areas of revival and spiritual awakening. Figures like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, both deeply influenced by Calvinist ideas, were key figures in the First and Second Great Awakenings. These revivals brought a renewed focus on personal faith and the drawing power of the gospel. However, not everyone agrees on how to interpret the role of revival in the history of Calvinism. Some see it as a natural extension of the Reformed emphasis on the sovereignty of God and the ruddy work of the Holy Spirit. Others, like D.G. Hart, argue that the revivalist tradition can sometimes overshadow the more liturgical and confessional aspects of Reformed worship. In the end, the story of Calvinism is a story of ongoing debate, deep theological reflection, and a commitment to understanding and living out the truths of the Christian faith. Whether you're a long-time Calvinist or just beginning to explore these ideas, the rich history and enduring impact of Reformed theology offer a lot to think about and discuss. As we look to the future, the legacy of Calvinism continues to shape the way Christians think and live. The debates may continue, but the core belief in the sovereignty of God, the grace of Christ, and the power of the Holy Spirit remains a cornerstone of the Reformed tradition. Whether you find yourself agreeing or disagreeing with these ideas, the journey of exploring them is one of growth, learning, and a deeper understanding of the faith.